When I look for what makes a movie good, I usually look for a good story. A story that...
No, Zack.
Oh, alter ego. It's you. What do you want?
You look at the poster and see if name actors are in it, okay?
Maybe that's part of it, but to me, a filmmaker's integrity is in telling an engaging story, and that's what makes the movie.
Don't give me that. We all judge books by their covers, dude.
Okay, and you, dude, should buzz off. Jeez. All right, now that he's gone, we can get on with our show. This week, we're continuing our conversation about interactive filmmaking. And if you haven't listened to part 1, where I interviewed the cast of my interactive movie for class, that is, I believe, episode 14, we had such a good time chatting with each other. I recommend you listen to that. And we talked about what it was like to work together and what it felt on their end as actors to play their parts in multiple timelines, right? Because if you're making an interactive movie, you're going to have to film every single possibility, every single part of that timeline, right? So there's different options that the viewer can choose, and that's what we're going to get into in this podcast. It is a bit more about the technicals behind pulling off an interactive film. So that's what you do, but first, I will roll that big Film Frat intro. Let's go.
This is the Film Fraternity Podcast, a show that's all about filmmaking in college, so you can turn your student projects into powerful portfolios. And now, here's the host of Film Frat House, Zack Sabo.
Hello, welcome back to the Film Frat Podcast. This is episode 15, and I'm your host, Zack Sabo, and today we're going to continue that conversation about interactive filmmaking. This is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1, please stop right now and go to episode 14 first. But without further ado, we will introduce our sponsor for this show. Okay, so when we're talking about the technicals of interactive filmmaking, I usually think first about passageways. Now, if you don't know what passageways are, just think about them as different layers of your film. So an interactive movie is what's considered non-linear. It doesn't follow a linear path, aka a straightforward path that you just go through the entire film and you don't have a say about anything that's going on. You're just observing, right? That's a linear film. But in a non-linear film, there are options. They have different segments, if you will. Different options where the viewer can choose which way to go throughout the story, what makes the story happen. So those are passageways, and they are the building blocks for interactive films, and they are basically chunks of your film that you insert using the softwares that I'm going to talk about in a bit. So first, okay, so let me back up a bit. We're going to talk about 2 different kinds of software that you can use to make your interactive movie. Now, this isn't limited to these 2 softwares. These are just ones that I have looked into and see that they work. And especially our first one, which is a free source software. It's a nonlinear story editor, actually. It's called Twine, and you may or may not have heard of it. Twine is a software that's based around HTML with a bit of JavaScript. So if you don't know anything about code, this might get a little bit icky for you. You might have to have a friend help you out with this, but Twine is a good place to start with the bare basics of nonlinear storytelling. And a lot of people have used it for telling little short stories, choose your own adventure stories, novels, and some of them have used it for games. And essentially, when you're making an interactive movie, you're making a game. So this is a great place to start, is Twine. It's free, completely free. You can search it up. They have 2 different versions of it. There's version 1 and version 2, but I recommend using version 2 because it's cleaner, more modern, and easier to understand. So, and interesting enough, Twine was used by the creators of Black Mirror Bandersnatch. And if you haven't seen that, that was the inspiration for my interactive film. And I'm sure for many others, because it's essentially the only interactive movie that is in existence on a streaming platform right now. A more adult interactive movie, quote unquote. Because there are some little kids games that exist on Netflix. But Bandersnatch is the first ever adult interactive film. So please watch Bandersnatch, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I'll also put a link to Twine and the other tidbits of information that we're going to talk about. So let's continue Twine. So yeah, Bandersnatch influenced my film. What's the difference between Bandersnatch and mine? Well, as a short film, my film was inevitably much shorter than Bandersnatch, obviously. I only had a few weeks to produce the film, essentially, for class. So we had a tight deadline. So in that sense, it was, I had less passageways that the audience could go through. And because of that, I also had passages that converged, meaning that when you deviate off of one path in your story, then you have a new part of your story that's continuing on from that point. And you could choose to branch out even further with other scenes that diverge from your earlier story points, if you know what I mean. So because my story was shorter and I wanted to film less, meaning that I film less footage, I wanted some scenes to kind of interconnect or show up again later in the film. So the story plots did not diverge that much. So that's the difference. With Bandersnatch, it was very sophisticated. Bandersnatch had different passageways that diverged multiple times. And sometimes it would be such a unique story in each iteration that you had to go down every single path to make the most out of the film, right? That's very interesting in my opinion. If I had more time, maybe I would have done the same. So with Twine, this is where you have to use some code. So once you develop the points between each divergence, you have these set of video files. That's what I did. So if you're familiar with editing regular films, linear films, you'll usually only have one export file, one file. With an interactive movie, you have several. For my film, I had probably 12 different video files. So how do you piece those together? So those are your sections of the story that can be unique. They can converge again. They can be used later, like different possibilities. You can use them in common with different passages. So, but it depends. It all depends on your story. So as far as the code goes, to actually embed these video files into Twine, this is specifically Twine, it uses HTML/CSS formatting, which means that you're essentially creating a web page. If you know anything about HTML, all websites today are based around HTML. So with Twine, it's very interesting. You're creating a website, in a sense, that's stored locally on your computer. And you reference those individual video files that are either stored on your computer or are stored on a separate hard drive. So I would recommend, to be honest, my opinion about Twine is that it's a good starting place. It's good to use it as a sort of outlining tool. And Bandersnatch, like the makers of Bandersnatch, used Twine to actually create a rough outline of the movie. They did not actually create the movie inside Twine because they actually developed their own system that was used to present the film on Netflix. It was a whole unique system that they coded themselves. But that's what happens when you have millions of dollars to spend. We, as indie filmmakers and students, try to get things for free. And that's what I'm going to try and give you, is anything that is free and available to the public for free. So Twine is free, yeah, it's a good place to start. But because it uses HTML, it's a bit clunky. It's not quite universal for every computer or every device if you want to present your movie on Twine, through Twine. You can present your film through Twine by embedding or referencing those video files through code, to which you then switch to the next passage by the click of a webpage button. So if you know anything about coding and HTML, websites in general, they all have links. They have buttons that you can click on. And when you're making an interactive movie, you have to have some sort of mechanism for the user to move on to the next scene and what choices they make. And so buttons are a way to do that. You have, 2, sometimes 3 buttons for different choices that you can make. And then it will load the next video file after a certain countdown. So yeah, you can do that. You can totally do that. But I found a different software that does it slightly better. More on that in a bit. But first, if you want to use Twine, please know some HTML, and because you're going to have to create your own buttons. You either you can embed video files into your project if you're using version 1. But the cool thing about version 2 of Twine is that you can reference those files, so they're not actually a part of the project. It's a little bit more flexible in my opinion. So yeah, it's really suited for people who want to make nonlinear stories. A novel, a short story, a game. It's a great way to make a choose-your-own-adventure in general. Now let's talk about the second piece of software, which in my opinion is a lot more versatile, and that is Unity. It is a game engine. If you know anything about gaming, game engines, you might recognize this. Unity is also free. You get a free license upon the activation of your free account with Unity. So it's great. It's free for anybody. The only catch is that you have a little splash page that kind of appears at the beginning of your game that says made with Unity. But, most people can live with that. Essentially, Unity is an interactive, so an interactive movie is a game. So using a game engine is not like a far-fetched idea when it comes to making your interactive movie. So, for example, Unity's system is based around different kinds of terminology. The first thing you should know in Unity is the concept of a game object. What is a game object? Well, a game object is an empty box. It's a variable. It's like an element in your game to which you can manipulate that object to move, to change. It's very flexible. You fill that box with whatever you want. And the cool thing about Unity is that they have an inbuilt video player component. And game objects have the ability to be added components onto them. So components can be added onto game objects. And these components are capable of manipulating the box, the game object. So the video player is a component. And I found that most video file formats are compatible with Unity. And I would double check that first before you export your video files. Please, and you want to use Unity, please check out the Unity docs. And I will put a link in the description, in the show notes. I'll put a link in the show notes to where you can view the file formats that are compatible with Unity. So please be aware of that. But back to the video player. It's really cool. I'm not gonna lie. I was looking at this and like attaching it to the game object, or my canvas, if you will, to the game, and it was playing full screen. You know, I just attached a random video file on my computer, and then I tried it out, and I was like, wow, this means that, you know, this changes everything. This changes the game of interactive storytelling, because now you can put any video file you want inside a game engine. So the think about this, Unity has two different formats for creating your project. You can initialize your project as a 2D template project. So your game is 2D, which in our case is what we'll go with, since our film is 2D. But imagine the ability to make your film in 3D space. So this is kind of weird. I don't know if I would suggest this starting out, but you could technically play around with 3D objects in Unity and attach your video player component onto a game object that is situated in 3D space. So that means your video might look a little funky because a video is 2D, but you can manipulate the game object's movement. You can transform the game object in your scene to move to a different location, or you can have a player camera that's situated in 3D space, and then have the player go through like a virtual gallery of your videos, you know? So you could like walk around as you would in a first-person shooter game. It's kind of an interesting concept if you think about it. So if you're going to use Unity, here are the steps that you go through. And I'll put a link in the show notes again for the compatible file formats before you go through with this. But if you're ready, here you go. So you create a canvas. If you go, I believe it's right-click in the hierarchy in Unity. You go under a new game object. You can say empty game object, okay? Which may work. I would play around with this. Empty game object, or go under the UI section of your game objects that you can create. And under UI, you can select canvas. And on this canvas, you can add the video player component. So once you have the canvas created in the hierarchy, make sure you click on it. Then on the right-hand side, by default, in Unity, you'll see your components listed. And usually transform is already in that component section. So that doesn't quite matter right now. I wouldn't touch it. But you can right-click and reset it to 0, 0 in your game space. And then you click Add Component, and then you search for Video Player, add that component, and here's what you'll see. There's a drop-down menu that by default says Video Clip. Now, this is for videos that you can import directly into your project. Remember how I was talking about how Twine version 1 allows you to import your video file directly into the project? Well, this is the same thing. This video clip option, and right below it, you select what video you want. This allows you to import that directly. Now, you can also reference your video files, like in Twine version 2. And here's how you do that. You change that drop-down to menu from video clip to URL. And this is where you might have to copy your URL on your computer to where the location of that video file is. And then you paste that location into Unity. So that's an interesting way of doing it. And you can also reference that file by means of where the project is stored on the computer. And if you know anything about code, you should be aware of this. When you give your final project to other people, and you have a URL that says, look under C drive, users, Zack, and it's not there, well, that means that you were referencing a URL that was unique to your computer, and no one else that you give your project to can access that video. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a bit tricky, so make sure everything's, your URLs are relative to where your project is, not to where it's hard-coded on your computer. So yeah, you might have to learn a little bit of terminology with Unity, to be honest. But it is very flexible, especially when it comes to buttons. Buttons. You create buttons. It's so much easier than coding it through HTML. It just really is, because like you would any other game object, you can create a button immediately in the hierarchy in Unity, and you can drag and drop that into your scene. Or you can drag that around into your scene, and you can create the button as a prefab. Another piece of terminology, a prefab is just a game object that you can reuse over and over again. That's saved as an asset, if you will. So the cool thing about the button creation process in Unity is that the text editor is a lot more flexible. You can transform the button sizes much more easily. You can change the play timing and all that stuff to advance the next part of your interactive story. So, such as something that's not available in Twine is the ability to instantly instantiate your videos into your scene by the click of a button. Actually, it's a lot more flexible in the sense that you can instantiate your videos on top of one another or underneath one another. So you can queue up your video and have it play slightly before the other video, right before the other video finishes. So that allows it to have a little more seamless transition. And the cool thing also is that you can have multiple videos in one scene, or have separate videos in separate scenes. Now, this is what's cool about Unity, is that the way that it's structured is through scenes that advance your game. But you can also have a game that's just one scene, and then have multiple game objects that are videos. And some of these game objects can be destroyed depending on the timing of your movie and which buttons people press, right? So I would definitely play around with that if you're going to use Unity. Remember, it is completely free, and I will post a more step-by-step reiteration of this whole process that I just talked about, because it's a lot to digest. I'm sorry for people who aren't acquainted with computer code, but we'll see. Yeah, I'll post it into the show notes. All right, so here are my final takeaway tips for you all. If you're gonna make an interactive film on your own, you're going to have to know some code. I'm sorry, it's either gonna be HTML, or if you're using Unity, you have to know C#. That is the primary language that Unity uses to advance, to interact with anything. So it's quite important to know code when making an interactive movie. But if you don't know any computer code, then find someone who does. You're gonna have to do that, because that's just the nature of an interactive movie. It is a game, essentially, where you have buttons. It's a simple game, but it's a game. So either way, in my opinion, it's not as hard as you might think it is. If I was able to pull it off in a few weeks, if I was able to pull off just the code writing in 1 week, then you can do it too. So what I would place at the top of your importance list of what's most important when making your interactive movie is write your script very carefully, because it has different passageways. Remember, I was talking about passageways in the beginning of your movie, in the beginning of this podcast. Excuse me. passageways are the building blocks of interactive movies. So remember that interactive films are non-linear and that they can tend to have more plot holes or errors than a regular linear film would. Just because of the nature of the complexity of an interactive film. There are layers, there are different timelines. So write the script carefully and make sure that others also read your script to make sure each passageway makes sense and checks out with one another, and that it doesn't ruin later parts of your movie. Because if you have scenes that diverge and then converge and then they come back later on, then that could definitely affect what happens later in the film, and it may not make sense logically. So definitely make sure that all adds up, and make sure that each passage adds value to your story, or entertainment value. So I always say story first. Put your story first. And if your film is just intended to entertain, like a comedy, for example, then make sure that each passageway adds entertainment value. It's kind of the same premise with a linear story. You have to know what makes your story valuable to other people and why others should watch your movie. It's the same premise. So don't make passages just for the sake of adding more passages to quote unquote impress others of how sophisticated your film is. Because some people might want to do that, you know? They create passages just to create more complexity and make it more complicated and make people come back to the beginning of the movie to see the other passages only to find out that it's like trash. Like, it doesn't make any sense, you know? So just make sure it adds value. Come on. It has to serve the story. So story first, embellishments later. And that is my final point for you all. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Film Frat podcast. Remember that you can find all the information that I talked about in this episode in the show notes on filmfrat.com. We have a nice community that's growing, and I'm excited to see you guys are listening, not watching yet, to this podcast. And I'm so happy and so honored to be here as a student filmmaker talking about my experiences. And I just feel like I'm in just such a place where I feel thankful for you all. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it grows and that other people listen to this and gain value out of this. This is why I want to make the podcast grow. It's because I want others to learn what I've been through and things that I've learned while in film school so that others don't make the same mistakes and that others can also impress others. Not for the sake of having others be jealous of you, but just to grow your wealth of knowledge that already exists. So again, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Remember to follow on Spotify or wherever you find podcasts, and that the show notes are at filmfrat.com, where I also have a mailing list. If you'd like to join it, you'll get a free camera guide that I made for student filmmakers who are interested in buying their own cameras. Their first camera, I may add. Because it's quite a maze out there of cameras. It's complicated and very diverse. You know, there's a lot of companies out there. There's a lot of specs. So I want to make sure you make the right decision. So again, thank you again. I said this the third time. All right, let's end this podcast already. You are gifted, you are creative, and you are able. Talk to you later.
That's all from this episode of the Film Fraternity Podcast. For more filmmaking tips and tricks you can use on your next project, visit www.filmfrat.com. That's FILMFRAT.com.